The first gunshot had stolen her voice, the second her family, and the third had sent Eleanor Whitfield fleeing into the night, barefoot and bloodstained, to a place where she swore the world would never find her again. The abandoned barn had stood for perhaps 40 years by 1879, its weathered timbers creaking like old bones whenever the Wyoming wind picked up. She'd made it her prison and her sanctuary for 5 long years, watching seasons change through cracks in the walls, speaking to no one but the mice and occasional barn owl that shared her hidden existence. Eleanor carefully swept the packed dirt floor with the crude broom she'd fashioned from twigs, the morning light filtering through gaps in the walls. Her routine never varied: maintain the barn, tend her small vegetable patch under cover of darkness, and remain as invisible as possible to the world beyond her self-imposed exile. The ranch the barn belonged to had been abandoned years before she arrived. The main house nothing but charred ruins after what locals likely assumed was a lightning strike. Far enough from the nearest town of Rivercross that casual travelers rarely ventured by, it provided the perfect hiding place for a woman the world had forgotten. She wore her hair cropped short, a necessity after the first year when she'd run out of pins to keep it tidy. Her once fine dresses had long since worn through, replaced by garments she'd cobbled together from old burlap sacks and canvas she'd scavenged. At 27, her hands were rough and calloused, her once soft features weathered by exposure and hardship. The small mirror shard she kept wrapped in cloth rarely reflected back the society woman she'd once been. That woman had died in Cheyenne, alongside her parents and younger brother. That woman had trusted too easily, spoken too freely, and paid a devastating price. Eleanor had just finished her morning tasks when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of horses' hooves and wagon wheels approaching along the overgrown road. In 5 years, she'd become expert at distinguishing between natural sounds and man-made ones. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she quickly extinguished her small cooking fire and gathered her few precious possessions, ready to flee deeper into the forest behind the barn if necessary. But the wagon stopped directly outside. She crouched in the shadows, near a loose board she'd carefully prepared for just such emergencies, waiting for whoever it was to take what they wanted and leave. Most travelers who stumbled upon the barn simply gathered a bit of shelter during storms or rested their horses before moving on. Instead, heavy footsteps approached the barn door, followed by 3 firm knocks that seemed to echo through the cavernous space. "Hello," a deep voice called. "Is anyone in there?" Eleanor remained frozen, scarcely breathing. 5 years of silence had trained her well. "I know someone's here," the voice continued. "Smoke from your chimney. Fresh turned earth in that garden patch. I'm not here to cause trouble." The baby's cry startled her so badly she nearly gasped aloud, a high, plaintive wail that spoke of hunger and discomfort. "Please," the man's voice softened. "We need help. My daughter, she needs a woman's care. I've been alone with her too long, and I don't know what to do anymore." Eleanor's fingers dug into the dirt floor, anchoring herself against the pull of that tiny, desperate cry. 5 years of solitude had made her suspicious of every human sound, but something about the raw desperation in the man's voice reached past her defenses. "I can leave some food here," the man continued. "And coin, fair payment. I just need help with my little girl, just for a day maybe. She's got a fever I can't break, and I'm at my wit's end." The baby's cries intensified, and Eleanor felt something inside her chest crack open, a feeling she'd thought long dead. Maternal instinct, perhaps, or simply human compassion that 5 years of isolation hadn't quite killed. Slowly, she rose from her hiding place. Her legs trembled beneath her as she approached the door, placing her palm against the weathered wood. 5 years of hiding. 5 years of safety. Was she really going to throw it away for a stranger and his child? The baby wailed again, and Eleanor found her hand moving to the crude latch. She pulled the door open just enough to peer through the gap, squinting in the harsh daylight. He stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, the sun at his back making his features difficult to discern. But she could see enough trail-worn clothes, a gun belt slung low on his hips and cradled awkwardly against his chest, a small bundle wrapped in what appeared to be his own shirt. "We need you," he said simply, his voice breaking on the last word as he held out the squirming, feverish infant. Eleanor stared at the tiny red face, no more than 6 months old, and felt the world she'd so carefully constructed begin to crumble. Yorick Miller had been riding for 3 days straight, stopping only when absolutely necessary to tend to his daughter. Emma's fever had started suddenly, her usual happy babbling replaced by inconsolable crying and a warmth that seemed to radiate from her tiny body. At 32, Yorick had faced down rustlers, survived 2 harsh Montana winters alone in a line cabin, and once narrowly escaped a grizzly bear with nothing but a hunting knife. But nothing had prepared him for the helplessness he felt watching his daughter suffer while having no idea how to ease her pain. His wife Martha had died bringing Emma into the world, leaving him with precious little knowledge of infant care. For 6 months he'd managed, clumsily at first but with growing confidence, until this fever struck and reminded him just how inadequate a father he truly was. He'd been heading toward Rivercross, hoping to find a doctor, when he spotted smoke coming from what he'd assumed was an abandoned homestead. Desperation had driven him to investigate, hoping at the very least to find a woman who might know more about sick babies than he did. Now, facing the wary, wild-eyed woman who had opened the barn door just a crack, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. She looked more feral than feminine, with cropped hair that appeared to have been cut with a dull knife and clothes that seemed cobbled together from sacking. But her eyes, though suspicious, held intelligence, and her hands, visible on the edge of the door, showed the careful deliberateness of someone accustomed to tending things. "Please," he said again, holding Emma toward her. "She's burning up. I've tried cool cloths, tried everything I know." "I'm afraid she'll—" He couldn't finish the sentence. The woman's eyes darted from his face to the baby and back again, calculation and fear evident in her expression. For a moment, he thought she would slam the door. Instead, she opened it wider, though she kept the solid wooden barrier between them like a shield. "Bring her in," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "But keep your distance from me." Yorick nodded quickly, relief flooding through him as he ducked through the doorway. The barn's interior was surprisingly orderly, with a small living area established in one corner. He noticed a pallet bed made of straw covered with what appeared to be grain sacks sewn together, a few crude shelves holding carefully arranged jars and tools, and a small fire pit with a clever chimney arrangement that must have directed most of the smoke outside through the wall. "Put her there," the woman instructed, pointing to the pallet. Yorick carefully laid Emma down, his daughter's cries softening slightly in the dimmer light of the barn. The woman approached cautiously, keeping him always in her sight as she knelt beside the baby. Her movements were those of someone who expected to be struck at any moment. "How long has she been fevered?" she asked, gently placing a hand on Emma's forehead. 2 days now. Started mild, got worse fast." The woman nodded, carefully unwrapping the makeshift swaddling. "She's too bundled." "Trapping the heat." Her fingers worked quickly, methodically checking the baby's body. "No rashes that I can see, eyes clear. Has she been eating?" "Not much. Fussy at the bottle." The woman's head snapped up. "No wet nurse. Her mother died birthing her." "Been feeding her cow's milk with a bit of sugar water like the midwife showed me." Something flickered across the woman's face, sympathy, perhaps, quickly masked by that same wary caution. "She needs to be cooled and hydrated. Do you have clean cloths? Water?" Yorick nodded, reaching for his saddlebag. "Got both. Some dried herbs too, though I don't know what's good for fevers." The woman held out her hand, keeping well beyond his reach. "Let me see what you have." For the next hour, Eleanor worked methodically, soaking cloths in cool water and laying them on the baby's forehead, chest, and the bottoms of her tiny feet. She steeped a mild tea from some of the herbs the man Yorick. He'd said his name was had carried, coaxing small amounts into the baby's mouth using a clean rag dipped in the liquid. All the while, she kept the father at a careful distance, instructing him to fetch water or stoke the small fire but never allowing him to come too close. Old habits from a life she'd left behind surfaced as she worked memories of helping the cook tend to her younger brother during a childhood illness. Knowledge gleaned from the family doctor, who had often let her assist him when he visited their home. "The fever's coming down," she said finally, touching the baby's cheek. "Not gone, but better." Yorick exhaled heavily, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Thank God, and thank you, miss." Eleanor hesitated, the name she'd abandoned years ago feeling strange on her tongue. "Eleanor," she said finally, the word barely audible. "Eleanor," he repeated, "I'm in your debt." She shook her head sharply. "No debts, you'll take her and go once she's stable." "Of course," he agreed quickly, though his eyes took in the barn with unveiled curiosity. "You've been here a while, I take it?" Eleanor's shoulders stiffened. "That's not your concern." "No, it's not," he agreed easily. "But 5 years is a long time to be alone." Her head snapped up, eyes wide. "How did you, the post date on that almanac?" He nodded toward one of her few books, carefully preserved on a shelf. 1874. Looks well read, but it's the newest thing here. And there's 5 years of careful repairs to this place, 5 growing seasons in that garden patch. Eleanor felt exposed, as if he'd somehow seen through walls she'd spent years building. She turned her attention back to the baby, avoiding his too perceptive gaze. "Emma seems to like you," he observed as the baby's tiny fingers curled around Eleanor's thumb. "She's a good judge of character." "She's responding to gentle handling," Eleanor corrected, though something warm and forgotten bloomed in her chest at the infant's trusting grip. "Babies need consistency and calm. 2 things I've been short on lately," Yorick admitted. "Been on the move since spring, trying to reach my brother's place near Rivercross. He's got land there, offered to help me get established so Emma can have a proper home." Eleanor said nothing, but her hands continued their gentle ministrations, wiping the baby's flushed face with a cool cloth. Despite her determination to remain detached, she found herself studying the tiny features, the bow-like mouth, the wisps of dark hair, the long eyelashes that fluttered as the child drifted into a more peaceful sleep. "She needs to stay quiet and cool for at least a day," Eleanor said finally. "Traveling will make the fever worse. Then we'll stay put if you'll allow it," Yorick said. "I can sleep in the wagon, give you your privacy." Eleanor's instinct was to refuse, to send them away the moment the baby showed improvement. But the thought of the infant back in a jolting wagon, exposed to dust and heat, made her hesitate. "One night," she conceded reluctantly. "In the wagon, as you said. I'll keep the baby here where it's cooler." If Yorick was surprised by her offer, he hit it well. "That's more than fair. I've got some provisions to share: jerky, coffee, a bit of cornmeal. Not much, but I'm happy to contribute." Eleanor nodded stiffly, already wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. 5 years of solitude had kept her safe, had kept the nightmares at bay. Now she'd invited a stranger, a man with a gun, into her sanctuary and agreed to keep his child overnight. Every instinct screamed for her to reconsider. But as Emma's tiny fingers tightened around her thumb in sleep, Eleanor felt something like purpose stirring within her. One night. She could survive one night, and then they would be gone, and she could return to the safety of her isolation. The afternoon stretched into evening as Emma slept fitfully, occasionally waking with whimpers that Eleanor soothed with cool cloths and gentle humming. Yorick busied himself outside, tending to his horse and setting up his camp near the wagon, respecting Eleanor's clear desire for distance. When he returned with a pot of coffee and a plate of simple food, jerky softened in the pan with cornmeal cakes, Eleanor accepted it warily, keeping the sleeping infant between them like a shield. "You've done this before," Yorick observed, nodding toward Emma. "Tended to sick children, I mean." Eleanor took a sip of the coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute she'd been using for years, before answering. I helped with my brother sometimes, when he was small. Where is he now? Your family? The question landed like a physical blow. Eleanor set the cup down carefully, her appetite vanishing. Dead. Yorick's expression softened with genuine regret. I'm sorry, that was thoughtless of me. It was a long time ago, she said, the lie bitter on her tongue. 5 years wasn't long at all when the memories remained so vivid. Is that why you're here, alone? Eleanor stood abruptly, nearly upsetting the plate. I don't discuss my past, not with anyone, especially not with strangers who will be gone tomorrow. Yorick raised his hands in a placating gesture. Fair enough, no more questions, but the damage was done. The fragile ease that had developed between them as they tended to Emma had shattered, replaced by the familiar tension that had become Eleanor's constant companion. She retreated to her corner of the barn, keeping a watchful eye on both father and daughter as night fell. When Emma began to fuss again, Eleanor prepared another bottle of the diluted milk, adding a drop of honey from her precious small jar, a luxury she'd harvested from a wild beehive the previous summer. Try this, she said, handing the bottle to Yorick. She'll take it better from you. She knows your smell, your voice. Yorick took the bottle, their fingers brushing momentarily in the exchange. Eleanor withdrew her hand quickly, but not before noticing the calluses that matched her own hands that worked hard, that built things, that survived. Thank you, he said softly, cradling Emma as he offered her the bottle. For all of this, I know it's not easy having us here. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, watching as the baby eagerly accepted the bottle. She's innocent in all this. Whatever else happens in the world, babies deserve care. And what about their fathers? Yorick asked, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Do they deserve a little mercy too? The question hung between them, neither teasing nor demanding, but genuine in a way that made Eleanor uncomfortable with its simplicity. She'd spent so long seeing all men as threats that the idea of offering one mercy seemed foreign, dangerous. Depends on the father, she said finally, retreating to her pallet and turning her back on him, a clear signal that conversation was over for the night. But sleep eluded her as she listened to Yorick's low, rumbling voice singing softly to Emma. The lullaby was unfamiliar, something about prairie winds and starlight, but the tenderness in his tone was unmistakable. Despite everything, Eleanor found herself envying the baby to be so loved, so protected when her own world had crumbled into ash and blood. When morning came, Eleanor woke to find Yorick already outside, the sound of chopping wood filtering through the barn walls. She checked on Emma, relieved to find the baby's skin cool to the touch, her eyes bright and alert as she waved tiny fists in the air. Better today, aren't you? Eleanor murmured, allowing herself a small smile as Emma gurgled in response. Your papa will be pleased. She gathered the baby into her arms, surprised by how natural it felt after her initial hesitation. 5 years without human contact, yet her body remembered how to cradle an infant, how to support the delicate head, how to rock gently to prevent fussing. The barn door creaked open, and Yorick entered with an armload of freshly split wood. He stopped short at the sight of Eleanor holding his daughter, an expression crossing his face that she couldn't quite interpret. Thought I'd repay your kindness with some firewood, he said, carefully setting the stack near her fire pit. Emma looks better. The fever's broken, Eleanor confirmed, reluctantly holding the baby out to him. She should be fine to travel now, slowly with plenty of stops for feeding and rest. Yorick took his daughter, his broad hands engulfing the tiny body with practiced ease. Thank you, Eleanor, truly. She nodded, already beginning to straighten her living space, erasing the evidence of their presence. The sooner they left, the sooner she could return to the safety of her routine. I've been thinking, Yorick said, shifting Emma to his shoulder. My brother's place is only about 10 miles from here. Good land, good water. He's got a proper house with a room to spare. His wife would welcome another woman's company. Eleanor froze, her hands stilling on the blanket she'd been folding. What are you saying? You could come with us, he said simply. Start fresh. Whatever you're hiding from, I'm not hiding, she cut in sharply, though they both knew it for the lie it was. All right, he conceded. Whatever you're avoiding, then, maybe it's time to stop avoiding it. 5 years is a long penance, Eleanor, for whatever happened. Anger flashed through her, hot and unfamiliar after years of careful numbness. You know nothing about me or what happened. Nothing. You're right, I don't, he agreed, his calm in the face of her anger only fueling her resentment. But I know a good person when I meet one. You helped us when you could have stayed hidden. You cared for Emma like she was your own. Those aren't the actions of someone who deserves to live alone in a barn for the rest of her life. Eleanor turned away, her hands shaking as she continued packing away the evidence of their stay. You should go, now, the morning's clear, good traveling weather. Eleanor, go. The word tore from her throat, louder than she'd spoken in years. Emma startled at the sound, her face scrunching up in preparation for a cry. Yorick bounced her gently, soothing her with practiced ease. All right, he said finally. We'll go, but my offer stands. My brother's place is the Reynolds Ranch, just north of Rivercross. Anyone in town can direct you. Eleanor said nothing, keeping her back to him as she heard him gather his remaining belongings. The barn door opened, and his footsteps receded. Minutes later, she heard the wagon wheels begin to turn, the creak of leather and wood as Yorick and his daughter departed. Only when the sounds had faded completely did Eleanor allow herself to sink to her knees, unexpected tears burning her eyes. The barn, which had been her haven for so long, suddenly felt emptier than it ever had before. The following days passed with excruciating slowness. Eleanor found herself listening for sounds that never came: a baby's cry, a man's deep voice, the creak of wagon wheels. The silence she had once cherished now pressed against her like a physical weight. She went through her routines mechanically, tending her garden, mending her clothes, preparing her simple meals, but the purpose had leached from these activities. For 5 years, survival had been enough. Now, in the wake of her brief connection with Yorick and Emma, mere survival felt hollow. At night, she found herself thinking of the baby's trusting grip on her finger, of Yorick's offer of a different life. She imagined the Reynolds Ranch with its proper house and spare room, trying to picture herself there among people, part of a community again after so long alone. But then the nightmares would come, the same ones that had haunted her for 5 years: gunshots in the darkness, her mother's scream, her father collapsing beside the dinner table, her brother's wide, unseeing eyes. And the voice, that terrible voice, promising to find her no matter where she ran. On the 4th day after Yorick's departure, Eleanor was splitting kindling when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Her heart lurched, hand instinctively reaching for the knife at her belt as she ducked inside the barn, peering through a crack in the wall. It wasn't Yorick's wagon. Instead, 2 riders approached, their manner casual as they surveyed the property. Eleanor's blood ran cold as she recognized the emblem on one man's vest: the Pinkerton Detective Agency. 5 years and they were still looking for her. She shrank back from the wall, mind racing. Her few belongings were already packed, a habit she'd never abandoned, always ready to flee at a moment's notice. There was a loose board at the rear of the barn that would allow her to slip into the forest beyond. But as she gathered her small bundle, Eleanor realized with startling clarity that she was tired of running. 5 years of looking over her shoulder, of speaking to no one, of existing rather than living. 5 years of letting fear dictate her every move. The memory of Emma's tiny hand wrapped around her finger surfaced unexpectedly, of Yorick saying, "We need you." When was the last time anyone had needed her? When was the last time she had mattered to another human being? The riders were dismounting now. She could hear their boots on the hard, packed earth outside. Eleanor made her decision in an instant. Grabbing her bundle and her father's old revolver, the one possession she'd managed to salvage that terrible night, she slipped through the loose board and into the forest beyond. But instead of heading deeper into the wilderness as she had always planned, she turned north, toward Rivercross. Toward the Reynolds Ranch. The journey took Eleanor 2 days on foot, keeping to the forest rather than the main road. She moved cautiously, years of solitude having honed her ability to travel unseen. When she finally spotted the buildings of Rivercross in the distance, she hesitated, almost turning back to the safety of isolation. The town was smaller than she remembered, a single main street with perhaps 24 buildings. From her vantage point on a small rise, she could see people moving about, their business women carrying baskets, men loading wagons, children darting between buildings in play. Ordinary life continuing as it always had without her. Eleanor approached cautiously, keeping her hat pulled low. Her men's clothing, patched trousers, and a faded shirt she'd scavenged years ago would draw less attention than her makeshift dresses. With her cropped hair and sun-weathered skin, she might pass for a young man at a distance. She skirted the main street, approaching a livery stable at the edge of town where an older man was brushing down a horse. "Pardon," she said, her voice rusty with disuse. "Could you direct me to the Reynolds Ranch?" The man squinted at her, clearly trying to determine if she was man or woman. Eleanor kept her posture straight, her expression neutral. "Reynolds Place, 'bout 3 miles north. Follow the creek, can't miss it. Big white farmhouse, red barn." He tilted his head. "You got business with them?" "Message to deliver," Eleanor said shortly, touching the brim of her hat in thanks before turning away. "Hold up," the man called. "Wagon heading that way shortly. Delivering some furniture Mrs. Reynolds ordered. Could save you the walk if you don't mind waiting." Eleanor hesitated, the offer tempting after 2 days on foot, but the fewer people who saw her, the safer she would be. "Thank you, but I prefer walking," she said, already moving away. "Suit yourself," the man shrugged. "Tell York his leather order came in if you see him." Eleanor froze. York. Yorick Miller, brother-in-law to Reynolds, been staying there since last week with that baby of his. The confirmation that Yorick had reached his destination safely sent an unexpected flood of relief through Eleanor. She nodded her thanks and continued north, following the creek as instructed. The Reynolds Ranch came into view exactly as the livery man had described, a substantial white farmhouse with a red barn and several outbuildings, nestled in a gentle valley with the creek running alongside. Fields of wheat stretched to the east, and a small orchard bloomed to the west. It was the picture of prosperity and permanence, everything her life had lacked for 5 years. Eleanor hesitated at the edge of the property, doubt suddenly overwhelming her. What was she doing here? Did she really expect to walk up to these strangers' door and ask for sanctuary? And Yorick, what must he think of her after she'd practically driven him away? As she stood frozen with indecision, a woman's voice called out from the direction of the orchard. "Hello there. Can I help you?" Eleanor turned to see a pleasant-faced woman in her 30s approaching, a basket of early apples on her hip. Her expression was open and curious rather than suspicious. "I'm looking for Yorick Miller," Eleanor said, her voice barely audible. The woman's face brightened. "York. He's down at the creek with Emma. Are you a friend of his?" Her eyes narrowed slightly as she took in Eleanor's appearance. "Or perhaps, are you Eleanor?" Shock rendered Eleanor momentarily speechless. "He told you about me." The woman smiled, setting down her basket and wiping her hands on her apron. "Hasn't stopped talking about the woman who saved Emma's life. I'm Sarah Reynolds, York's sister-in-law. Come inside, you look exhausted." Eleanor shook her head, taking a step back. "I should find Yorick first." "Explain why I'm here." "Of course," Sarah nodded, pointing toward a path that led down to the creek. "Follow that trail. He takes Emma there every afternoon, says the sound of the water helps her sleep." Her expression softened. "He'll be mighty glad to see you, Eleanor, mighty glad indeed." Eleanor murmured her thanks and turned toward the creek path, her heart pounding so hard she was certain Sarah must hear it. What would she say to Yorick? How could she explain her sudden appearance after sending him away so abruptly? The path wound through a stand of cottonwoods before opening onto a small clearing beside the creek. And there, seated on a fallen log with Emma cradled in his arms, was Yorick. He looked different, somehow cleaner, less trail-worn, his dark hair trimmed and his beard neatly shaped. He was speaking softly to Emma, pointing at something in the water, his deep voice carrying on the afternoon breeze. Eleanor stood frozen at the edge of the clearing, suddenly acutely aware of her own bedraggled appearance after days of travel. Perhaps this had been a mistake. Perhaps Eleanor. Yorick had spotted her, rising to his feet with Emma secure in one arm. His expression was one of complete astonishment. "What are you doing here? Are you all right?" The genuine concern in his voice broke something loose inside her. "They found the barn," she said simply. "Pinkerton's." "I had to leave." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "And you came here, to us." The word "us" struck her with unexpected force, the simple inclusion, the assumption of connection. Eleanor nodded, unable to find more words. Yorick crossed the clearing, stopping a respectful distance away, clearly remembering her aversion to proximity. "I'm glad," he said simply. "Emma will be too when she wakes up." As if on cue, the baby stirred in his arms, her eyes fluttering open. She blinked drowsily, her gaze fixing on Eleanor. And then, astonishingly, she smiled, a gummy, drooling grin of pure delight. "See," Yorick said softly, "she remembers you." Eleanor felt a smile tugging at her own lips, unfamiliar after so many years of grim determination. "She's looking well. Thanks to you." Yorick hesitated, then asked, "How long can you stay?" The question hung between them, weighted with possibility. Eleanor looked from Yorick to Emma and back again, seeing the hope he couldn't quite conceal. "I don't know," she admitted. "I haven't thought beyond getting here." "Then stay until you decide," he suggested. "My brother and Sarah have plenty of room. You'd be safe here, Eleanor, I promise you that. Safety. Such a simple concept, yet one that had eluded her for 5 long years. Could she really find it here among these strangers? With this man and his child who had somehow breached the walls she'd built around herself, the Pinkertons, she began hesitantly. "They're still looking for me." "Why?" Yorick asked gently. "What happened, Eleanor?" 5 years of silence pressed against her throat, the story she'd never told threatening to spill out. But here, in this peaceful clearing with the creek murmuring beside them and Emma's innocent eyes watching her, the weight of secrets suddenly seemed too heavy to bear alone. "My father was a banker in Cheyenne," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He discovered evidence of fraud, prominent men in the territory using bank funds to bribe officials to secure land grants illegally. He was going to testify." Yorick nodded, his expression grave but not surprised. "Powerful men don't like witnesses." "No," Eleanor agreed, bitterness coloring her tone. "They sent men to our home during dinner. My father, mother, younger brother all killed. I only survived because I'd gone to the kitchen for more water when I heard the shots." She swallowed hard. "I hid. Like a coward, I hid while they murdered my family." "You survived," Yorick corrected gently. "There's no cowardice in that. The men who did it, they work for the Pinkertons now, hired to find me to eliminate the last witness." Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides. "For 5 years I've been running, hiding, barely living." "Until now," Yorick said, shifting Emma to his other arm, "until you chose to come here." Eleanor met his gaze, allowing herself to truly look at him for the first time, the clear, steady eyes, the strong lines of his face softened by compassion, the careful way he held his daughter. In another life, in another time, he was a man she might have been introduced to at a social gathering, might have danced with, might have come to know through proper courtship. Instead, fate had thrown them together in the most unlikely of circumstances, and now he was offering her something she'd never expected to find again: sanctuary. "Yes," she said finally, "until I chose to come here." Yorick smiled, the expression transforming his face. "Then let me welcome you properly to the Reynolds Ranch, Eleanor. We've been expecting you." "You have?" "Well, hoping at least," he amended, gesturing toward the path back to the house. "Emma needs you, and maybe I do too." The admission hung in the air between them, neither a declaration nor a demand, but a simple truth offered without expectation. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest, unfamiliar but not unwelcome. "I should meet your brother and properly thank Sarah," she said, deflecting the moment of intimacy that felt too overwhelming after years of isolation. "Of course," Yorick agreed easily, falling into step beside her as they walked back toward the house. "Fair warning, they'll have 1,000 questions." "I don't have to answer them all at once, do I?" Eleanor asked, a hint of dry humor surfacing unexpectedly. Yorick chuckled, the sound rich and warming. "No, Eleanor, you have all the time in the world now, all the time in the world." The phrase echoed in her mind as they approached the farmhouse. For 5 years, she had lived each day expecting it to be her last, waiting for discovery, for capture, for the end of her solitary existence. The idea of a future stretching before her, unwritten and full of possibility, was almost too much to comprehend. But as Emma reached out a tiny hand toward her, as Yorick smiled encouragingly, Eleanor took the first step toward that future, climbing the porch steps of the Reynolds farmhouse and leaving the shadows of the past behind. The following weeks passed in a blur of adjustment for Eleanor. The Reynolds family, Edward, Sarah, and their 2 young sons welcomed her with a warmth that was both overwhelming and healing. They asked few questions about her past, seeming to take their cue from Yorick's protective attitude toward her privacy. Sarah provided Eleanor with proper women's clothing, simple but well-made dresses that felt strange after years in makeshift garments. The first time she saw herself in the mirror wearing a blue calico dress with her growing-out hair neatly combed, Eleanor barely recognized the woman staring back at her. "You look lovely," Sarah had said, coming to stand beside her. "Though you don't quite believe it yet, do you?" Eleanor had shaken her head, unable to reconcile this presentable woman with the wild creature she'd become in the barn. "I feel like I'm pretending to be someone I was long ago. Or perhaps," Sarah had suggested gently, "you're becoming someone new altogether." That idea of becoming someone new rather than reclaiming a lost self sustained Eleanor as she gradually integrated into life at the Reynolds ranch. She helped Sarah with household tasks, discovering that many of the survival skills she'd developed in isolation translated well to domestic work. Her knowledge of herbs and plants proved especially valuable, and soon she was tending a small medicinal garden beside Sarah's kitchen patch. But it was with Emma that Eleanor found her greatest comfort. The baby had taken to her immediately, seeming to remember the woman who had nursed her through fever. Yorick, observing their growing bond, increasingly included Eleanor in Emma's care, inviting her opinion on introducing solid foods, seeking her help with the baby's first attempts at crawling, sharing the triumph of Emma's first coherent word, "Da." "You're a natural with her," Yorick remarked one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset while Emma played with wooden blocks at their feet. "She adores you." Eleanor smiled, a gesture that came more easily now after weeks among people who treated her with kindness. "She's an easy child to adore in return." "Not always," Yorick chuckled. "Try saying that at 3 in the morning when she's cutting a tooth." "Even then," Eleanor insisted, reaching down to stroke Emma's dark curls, "there's something miraculous about her determination. Even when she's crying, you can see the strength in her." "Like someone else I know," Yorick said quietly, his gaze on Eleanor rather than his daughter. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks, still unaccustomed to direct compliments after years of isolation. "I should help Sarah with supper," she said, rising quickly. Yorick caught her hand gently before she could retreat. "Eleanor, you don't have to run every time conversation turns personal, not with me." His touch was warm, his calloused palm rough against her equally work-hardened hand. 5 years ago, Eleanor would have worn gloves for propriety's sake when touching a man. Now, the directness of skin against skin sent a current through her that was both alarming and exhilarating. "I'm not used to it," she admitted, not pulling away despite her instinct to flee. "To being seen. To being known." "I'd like to know you better," Yorick said simply. "If you'd allow it." The openness of his expression, the honest warmth in his eyes made something tight in Eleanor's chest begin to unwind. For 5 years she had survived by being invisible. Now this man, this good, patient man, wanted to truly see her. "I'd like that too," she admitted softly, the words feeling like a greater risk than any she'd taken in her years on the run. Yorick smiled, giving her hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. "Then we'll start slow. One conversation at a time." True to his word, Yorick began seeking out opportunities for quiet conversation, with Eleanor joining her as she hung laundry, accompanying her on walks to the creek with Emma, sitting beside her in the evenings as the household settled into after-dinner activities. He shared stories of his life growing up in Missouri, heading west as a young man, meeting his late wife Martha during a cattle drive, his grief at her loss in childbirth, and his determination to give Emma a stable home. In return, Eleanor gradually revealed pieces of her own history: her childhood in Philadelphia, her family's move to Cheyenne as the territory developed, her education at a ladies' seminary back east, her love of books and music. She spoke of her parents with growing ease, finding that sharing memories of their love and guidance helped heal the rawness of their loss. But she never discussed the night they died, or the specific details of why the Pinkertons sought her. That darkness remained locked away, too dangerous to release even in this newfound safety. Summer turned to early autumn, the days growing shorter as the wheat fields surrounding the ranch were harvested. Eleanor had been at the Reynolds Ranch for nearly 3 months when Edward returned from town one day with a troubled expression. The family had gathered for supper, Emma happily mashing potatoes in her high chair while the adults discussed the day's events. Edward waited until his sons had been excused from the table before clearing his throat. "Strangers in town," he said, his gaze meeting Yorick's meaningfully. "Asking questions about new arrivals in the area, particularly interested in single women." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "Pinkertons?" Edward nodded grimly. 2 men, didn't give their agency, but they had that look about them. Described themselves as representatives of concerned parties in Cheyenne. "Did they show a photograph?" Eleanor asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Of me?" "Not that I saw," Edward replied. "But they're making the rounds of all the nearby ranches. They'll be here eventually." Yorick's hand found hers under the table, squeezing reassuringly. "They won't find you here." "Of course they will," Eleanor said, a familiar coldness settling in her stomach. "This was always temporary, I knew that." "No," Yorick said firmly, "we'll find a way, we always do." Sarah leaned forward, her practical nature asserting itself. "What if they're not looking for Eleanor at all? What if it's just coincidence?" "It's not," Eleanor said with certainty. "They've been searching for 5 years. They won't stop until they find me or confirm I'm dead." "Then perhaps," Edward said slowly, "that's our solution." All eyes turned to him, confusion evident on every face. "Eleanor Whitfield needs to die," he explained. Officially, Yorick frowned. "What are you suggesting exactly?" "A grave," Edward said simply, "in the River Cross Cemetery, with a headstone that says Eleanor Whitfield died in, say, 1877, consumption perhaps or fever, common enough not to raise suspicion. But I'd still be here," Eleanor pointed out, "still visible." "As someone else," Sarah interjected, catching on to her husband's thinking. "Not as Eleanor Whitfield, but as—" "My wife," Yorick said suddenly. The table fell silent, all eyes shifting to him in shock. Eleanor stared, certain she had misheard. "You're what?" she finally managed. "My wife," Yorick repeated, turning to face her directly. "Eleanor Miller, not Whitfield. Widow from Montana who came to help care for Emma after her cousin Martha died. We met there, married quietly, and you accompanied me here." "Anyone who might have known differently, Edward, Sarah, the children, they'll simply say you've been here all along." "But that's," Eleanor struggled to find words. "That's absurd, no one would believe it." "Why not?" Yorick challenged. "We're clearly comfortable together. You care for Emma as if she were your own. We're rarely apart. Most folks in town already assume there's something between us." "It would mean lying," Eleanor protested weakly. It would mean living, Yorick countered. Instead of running, instead of hiding. Eleanor looked around the table, expecting to see shock or disapproval on the faces of Edward and Sarah. Instead, she found thoughtful consideration. It could work, Edward admitted. I know the undertaker in town could arrange for a stone to be placed without questions. And I've mentioned a cousin Martha to several people in passing, Sarah added. No one would think to question it if I spoke of her widow coming to help with the baby. This is madness, Eleanor whispered, overwhelmed by their willingness to construct such an elaborate deception on her behalf. You'd all be complicit in fraud. We'd be complicit in justice, Yorick corrected gently. Those men murdered your family, Eleanor. They've stolen 5 years of your life already. I won't let them take any more. The fierce protectiveness in his voice sent a shiver through Eleanor. No one had defended her, fought for her, in so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to be valued in this way. And the marriage, she asked hesitantly. That would be a pretense as well. Something shifted in Yorick's expression, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. It doesn't have to be, he said quietly. Not if you don't want it to be. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. What are you saying, Yorick? He took both her hands in his, turning fully to face her as if they were suddenly alone in the room. I'm saying that I've come to care for you, Eleanor. Deeply. I see how you are with Emma, how you've blossomed here despite your fears. I see your strength, your kindness, your determination. And I find myself wanting to build a life with you, a real one, not just a pretense for others. But we've only known each other a few months, Eleanor protested weakly. Some people court for years and never truly know each other, Yorick said. Others meet and recognize something essential almost immediately. I believe we're the latter. Eleanor glanced at Emma, who was watching them with wide, curious eyes, potato forgotten on her tray. The baby gurgled happily, reaching out toward Eleanor as she always did, complete trust in her tiny face. I care for you both, Eleanor admitted, her voice barely audible. More than I thought possible after everything. But marriage, think of it this way, Sarah interjected gently. The legal ceremony would protect you from questions. The emotional commitment, that can develop at its own pace. No one says you must become husband and wife in every sense immediately. Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks at Sarah's delicate reference to marital intimacy. You make it sound so simple. It's not, Yorick acknowledged. Nothing worth having ever is, but I believe we could build something good together, Eleanor, something lasting. Emma chose that moment to bang her spoon against the high chair, demanding attention. The adults all laughed, the tension of the moment broken by the baby's perfect timing. She's voting yes, Edward joked, earning a gentle swat from Sarah. This isn't a democracy, Sarah chided, though her eyes twinkled with amusement. It's Eleanor's decision entirely. No pressure, Yorick added, though his hopeful expression belied his casual tone. Eleanor looked around the table at these people who had become her family in all but name. At Emma, who had captured her heart from that first fevered cry in the barn. At Yorick, whose steady presence had gradually healed wounds she'd thought permanent. For 5 years, she had existed in a state of suspended animation, not truly living, merely surviving from one day to the next. The thought of stepping into a new identity, of claiming a future she had never dared imagine, was terrifying. But the alternative, running again, returning to solitude, abandoning the connections she had formed here, was unthinkable. Yes, she said finally, the word slipping out almost of its own accord. Yes, I'll marry you, Yorick. His face broke into a smile so radiant it took her breath away. Before she could react, he had leaned forward and pressed a gentle kiss to her lips, their first brief but full of promise. Well then, Edward said, clearing his throat after a moment. I believe congratulations are in order, and we have some planning to do. The next week passed in a flurry of activity. Edward arranged for a headstone to be placed in the Rivercross Cemetery, bearing the name Eleanor Whitfield and dates that suggested she had died 2 years earlier. Sarah spread word among her friends in town about Yorick's wife, finally joining him from Montana, elaborating on the fiction of a quiet wedding following his first wife's cousin's tragic death. Meanwhile, Yorick secured a special license from the territorial judge who visited Rivercross monthly, explaining that they wished to have their Montana marriage properly recognized in Wyoming territory. The judge, more concerned with collecting his fee than investigating the details, granted the license without question. The actual ceremony took place in the Reynolds parlor, with only the family as witnesses. Eleanor wore a dress of pale blue silk that Sarah had worn for her own wedding, altered to fit Eleanor's slimmer frame. Yorick had trimmed his beard and wore a clean black suit that Edward had lent him for the occasion. As they stood before the local preacher, a kindly older man who knew nothing of their deception, Eleanor felt a curious sense of rightness. The vows they exchanged might have begun as a strategy for her protection, but as she looked into Yorick's eyes and promised to love, honor, and cherish him, she realized that she meant every word. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Miller." Yorick leaned forward, his hands gentle as they framed her face. The kiss was tender, reverent almost, and when he pulled away, Eleanor saw in his eyes the same wonder she felt that something begun in desperation had transformed into something genuine and precious. That night, after a celebratory meal and much teasing from Edward, Sarah showed Eleanor to the cabin that Yorick had been building at the edge of the Reynolds property, a modest but sturdy structure with 2 rooms, simple furniture, and windows that caught the evening light. "It's not quite finished," Yorick apologized as he carried Emma inside, "but it's ours, a place to start." "It's perfect," Eleanor said, meaning it. After 5 years in a barn, the small cabin seemed luxurious. An awkward silence fell between them as Sarah tactfully withdrew, leaving the new family alone. Emma, oblivious to the tension, happily explored the main room, crawling from one piece of furniture to another. "I meant what I said earlier," Yorick said finally, watching Eleanor carefully. "About taking things at our own pace. I've had a bed made up for you in the small room. Emma and I can share the main one until you're ready for something else." The consideration in his offer touched Eleanor deeply. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not for the separate rooms, but for understanding that this is all overwhelming." Yorick nodded, crossing to where she stood by the window. "We have time, Eleanor, all the time we need." As it happened, they needed less time than either might have anticipated. Over the following weeks, as they settled into life as a family, the artificial boundaries they had established gradually dissolved. Eleanor found herself lingering in the main room long after Emma had been put to bed, talking with Yorick by lamplight, sharing stories, dreams, and eventually, hesitant touches. The first time he kissed her properly, not the chaste peck of their wedding, but a real kiss full of longing and tenderness, Eleanor felt something inside her unlock. A door opening to feelings she had buried for survival's sake. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," she admitted afterward, her head resting against his shoulder as they sat before the fire. "After everything that happened, I thought that part of me was dead." "Not dead," Yorick murmured, his fingers gently stroking her hair, "just waiting. Like a seed under snow." That night, Eleanor made her choice, leaving her separate room to join Yorick in what became truly their bed. Their coming together was tender, unhurried, a mutual discovery of trust as much as passion. Afterward, lying in his arms with Emma sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby, Eleanor felt a sense of completion she had never expected to find again. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness, the words both terrifying and liberating. Yorick's arms tightened around her. "I've loved you since you opened that barn door," he confessed. "Even terrified and suspicious as you were, I saw something in you that called to me." "What a pair we made," Eleanor laughed softly. "A desperate father, a frightened recluse, and a fevered baby." "The beginnings of a family," Yorick corrected, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Our family." 2 weeks later, the Pinkertons came to the Reynolds ranch. Eleanor had been hanging laundry when she saw the dust from approaching riders. Something in the deliberate pace of their approach sent a chill of recognition through her. Without hesitation, she gathered Emma from her blanket on the grass and hurried inside. "They're coming," she told Sarah, who was kneading bread in the kitchen. "2 riders, Pinkertons, I'm certain." Sarah wiped her hands on her apron, her expression calm but determined. "Edward and Yorick are in the north field. I'll send one of the boys to fetch them. You take Emma to your cabin and stay there." Eleanor hesitated. "Maybe I should leave, draw them away from here." "Absolutely not," Sarah said firmly. "You're Eleanor Miller now, mother to Emma, wife to Yorick. You belong here. Remember that when they question you, because they will." Eleanor nodded, grateful for Sarah's steadying presence. She hurried to the cabin with Emma, her heart pounding as she heard the riders approach the main house. True to Sarah's prediction, it wasn't long before a knock came at the cabin door. Eleanor took a deep breath, settling Emma on her hip before answering. The 2 men standing on her threshold were unfamiliar, not the same ones who had murdered her family, but they carried themselves with the same calculated precision she remembered all too well. "Mrs. Miller?" the older of the 2 asked, his tone professionally pleasant. "I'm Agent Wilson with the Pinkerton Detective Agency. This is my colleague, Agent Harmon. We're making inquiries in the area and hoped you might have a moment to speak with us." Eleanor shifted Emma higher on her hip, using the child as both shield and anchor. "What sort of inquiries?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "We're searching for a missing woman," Wilson explained, producing a photograph from his coat pocket. "Eleanor Whitfield of Cheyenne. She disappeared approximately 5 years ago following a tragic incident. We have reason to believe she might have passed through this area." He held out the photograph, and Eleanor forced herself to look at it with an appropriate level of curiosity rather than recognition. The young woman in the image was almost a stranger to her, now elegantly dressed with her hair arranged in the latest fashion, smiling confidently at the camera without a hint of the trauma that would soon destroy her world. "I'm afraid I can't help you," Eleanor said, handing the photograph back. "I only arrived in the territory a few months ago from Montana." "So we've been told," Wilson nodded. "You're recently married to Yorick Miller, is that correct?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed, tension building in her spine, "though we were married in Montana before coming here." "Interesting," Wilson said, making a show of consulting a small notebook. "We have reports that Mr. Miller arrived here alone with his infant daughter. My husband traveled ahead to prepare our home," Eleanor explained, the rehearsed story flowing easily. "Emma is my niece by marriage. Her mother, my cousin, died in childbirth. I helped care for her until Yorick and I were wed, and then we decided to join his brother here in Wyoming." Harmon, who had been silent until now, stepped forward slightly. "You bear a striking resemblance to Miss Whitfield," he observed, his eyes narrowed. Eleanor forced a laugh. "Do I? I suppose that's a compliment. From the photograph, she appears to be a lady of quality." "She was," Wilson agreed. "Daughter of a prominent banker, the family was murdered by robbers, a terrible tragedy. Miss Whitfield was the only survivor, but she fled before she could testify against the perpetrators." "How awful," Eleanor murmured, bouncing Emma gently as the baby began to fuss. "But I don't see how I can help you." "Perhaps you've heard something," Wilson pressed. "Rumors of a woman living alone, someone who arrived suddenly with few belongings or connections." Eleanor was saved from answering by the arrival of Yorick, who approached the cabin with long, purposeful strides. She felt a rush of relief at the sight of him. "Gentlemen," Yorick called, his tone friendly but with an underlying edge of steel. "I see you've met my wife and daughter, Mr. Miller," Wilson acknowledged with a nod. "We were just asking Mrs. Miller if she might have encountered an Eleanor Whitfield in her travels." "Can't say we have," Yorick said, coming to stand beside Eleanor and placing a protective arm around her shoulders. "Though there is an Eleanor Whitfield buried in the Rivercross Cemetery, died of consumption 2 years back according to the stone, might be your missing woman." Wilson and Harmon exchanged glances. "We'll certainly investigate that possibility," Wilson said carefully. "Though our information suggested Miss Whitfield was very much alive, information can be wrong," Yorick shrugged. "Now, if you don't mind, my wife was about to put our daughter down for her nap, unless there's something specific you need from us." The dismissal was polite but firm. Wilson hesitated, his gaze lingering on Eleanor's face for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I think we have what we need for now," he said finally. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Miller, Mr. Miller." With a tip of their hats, the two agents departed, mounting their horses and heading back toward town. Eleanor sagged against Yorick the moment they were out of sight, her legs suddenly weak with released tension. "You did wonderfully," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her temple. "They suspected nothing." "They suspected everything," Eleanor corrected, her voice shaky, "but they couldn't prove it." "The grave was a stroke of genius." "Edward's idea," Yorick reminded her. "Though I suggested the consumption, common enough not to raise questions, difficult to disprove after the fact." Eleanor nodded, her mind racing ahead. "They'll investigate the grave." "When they find it's real, they'll still have doubts," Yorick acknowledged. "But without proof they can't act, and in time they'll move on to other cases, other priorities." "Do you really believe that?" Eleanor asked, searching his face. "I have to," Yorick said simply. "Because the alternative is unacceptable. I won't lose you, Eleanor, not to them, not to anyone." The fierce certainty in his voice steadied her. "Then we continue as we are, Eleanor Miller, wife and mother." "Not just continue," Yorick corrected, his expression softening. "We live, Eleanor. We build something so real that no one, not even those who seek to destroy it, can deny its truth." That night, after Emma was asleep, Eleanor sat at the small desk in their cabin and wrote 2 letters. The first was to a lawyer in Cheyenne whom her father had trusted, informing him of evidence hidden in a secret compartment of her father's desk, evidence that would expose the corruption her family had died to reveal. The second was to the territorial governor, detailing the events of that terrible night 5 years ago and naming the men responsible. "What are you doing?" Yorick asked, coming to stand behind her as she sealed the envelopes. "Ensuring that if anything happens to me, the truth comes out," Eleanor explained. "I'm tired of running, Yorick, tired of letting them win." "Nothing will happen to you," he promised, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Perhaps not," she agreed, "but I need to do this for my parents. For my brother. For the woman I was and the woman I've become." Yorick nodded, understanding without further explanation. "I'll take them to Edward tomorrow. He can post them from Cheyenne on his next business trip, less likely to be noticed than if they came from Rivercross." Eleanor rose, turning to face him. "Thank you for understanding, for everything." "No thanks needed between us," Yorick said softly, drawing her into his arms. "We're partners now in all things, partners." The word warmed her, its simple equality far more meaningful than traditional notions of husband and wife. In Yorick, she had found not just protection or passion, but true partnership, someone who valued her strength as much as her softness, who saw her fully and loved what he saw. That winter brought heavy snows to the valley, isolating the Reynolds ranch for weeks at a time. Far from feeling confined, Eleanor found herself treasuring the peaceful days spent in their snug cabin, watching Emma take her first tottering steps across the wooden floor, sharing long evenings of conversation with Yorick beside the fire, and gradually allowing herself to plan for a future she had once thought forever denied her. In the spring, news reached them that several prominent businessmen in Cheyenne had been arrested on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and murder. Among them were the men who had orchestrated the attack on the Whitfield family. Eleanor's letters, combined with the evidence her father had hidden, had finally brought justice, though few would ever know the role she had played. "Does it help?" Yorick asked as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold. "Knowing they'll face punishment." Eleanor considered the question, her hand absently stroking the gentle swell of her belly where their child, a sibling for Emma, grew steadily. "It helps," she said finally. Not because I wanted revenge, but because it means my family didn't die in vain. The truth they valued so highly has finally been heard. Yorick covered her hand with his own, his palm warm against the new life they had created together. And Eleanor Whitfield, does she rest easier now? Eleanor smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder as Emma played contentedly at their feet. Eleanor Whitfield found justice, she said softly, but Eleanor Miller found something far more precious. She found home. In the years that followed, the story of Eleanor Whitfield gradually faded from public memory. The grave in Rivercross Cemetery received occasional flowers from the Miller family, a quiet tribute to a past that had shaped but not defined the woman Eleanor had become. The Millers eventually built a larger home on land adjacent to the Reynolds Ranch, where they raised Emma alongside 3 children of their own, 2 boys and a girl, all with their mother's quiet strength and their father's steadfast heart. Their home became known throughout the valley for its warmth and hospitality, a safe haven for travelers and neighbors alike. Sometimes on summer evenings when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Yorick would find Eleanor standing at the window, looking out toward the distant hills with a faraway expression. "Remembering?" he would ask softly, coming to stand beside her. "No," she would answer, turning to him with a smile that still, after all these years, took his breath away. "Not remembering, just grateful, for that fever that brought you to my door, for your courage in knocking, for everything that followed." And Yorick, remembering that desperate day when he had stood outside a weathered barn with his sick child and nowhere else to turn, would gather his wife into his arms and whisper the words that had changed both their lives forever. "We needed you." To which Eleanor, safe in the life they had built together, would always reply with the simple truth that had set her free: "And I needed you."